Hello. I'm going to make some predictions. They're just speculations about what's going to happen over the next few years, and I don't claim to be any sort of a prophetess. On the other hand, I used to be a scriptwriter. And when you're writing a script, the best way to do it, there's a lot of rubbish coming out now in films, so you might not realize this, but the most solid way to do it is to flesh out some characters and then put them together, and then the story sort of writes itself. Or you put them in a certain situation, certain characters in a certain situation, and then you've got the story. And I can just talk to you about how I see what's going on in the USA now, and I might have the wrong characters or even the wrong situation. But this is the plot line I envisage. And I hope I'm getting it wrong. So I'll start by saying, without any sense of satisfaction whatsoever, I believe this is the end of America as we know it. It'll take a few years, and I might not actually live to see the worst of it. But I just want to give you the benefit of my knowledge of what happened to the Soviet Union. It took the Soviet Union a curve of about 70 years to go through a rising, a reaching of a period of stasis, and then a period of decline. And then it fell apart. And it's been taken over by what it wanted all along, a Tsar. Because that's how Russia always was. And old patterns don't just die hard, they don't die at all. Since the USA doesn't have any sort of pattern, then something else is going to happen, and that's something I can't predict. Fragmentation, perhaps, but I wouldn't stake my house on it. However, as I said, that's going to take time because we've got to go through the period of stasis first. If we look through the historical record, stasis always, well, it ends in one of two ways. A violent revolution, which generally starts off bravely enough and then sends things back, or more commonly, it turns into a general slow decline until it's picked off by a new and more vigorous power. It was what happened to the Western Roman Empire, to the Byzantine Empire, and indeed to the Ottoman Empire, which supplanted the Byzantine Empire. This is nothing new. What appears to be happening now is that America, which started its rise at the beginning of the 20th century, full of vigour and promise, is now entering a period of stasis. It might have been in a period of stasis before, actually, and Trump just sort of was a blip in that. And now it's re-established itself. And this will coast along for years. While the government fiddles about with gender-neutral words and transgender classes for preschoolers and changing the academic environment until the more obviously necessary things start to run out. Meanwhile, a lot of the vigour will drift away. We've already seen people who were based in California, like the Daily Wire, for instance, Ben Shapiro. They moved, I think Ben Shapiro moved from California to Tennessee. Well, when things go all over America, what's to stop these people from moving out of America altogether? Possibly to Canada, but I'll get to Canada in a minute. Otherwise, I can see cheeky upstarts like South Korea, Brazil, and Israel, which will be the ones to take over the inventive stuff because people can say what they think there. All of these countries, though, still need the protection of American firepower, especially South Korea and Israel. So they might very well end up propping America up one way or another. And so the system will persist for longer than it might have done. And this might even apply to Britain if she succeeds in properly disengaging from the EU, which is also entering a period of stasis, by the way. But I'm not banking on Britain leaving the EU. There are many vested interests that might prevent that. However, it might yet happen, especially if there's a coalition with Australia and New Zealand. Now, back to Canada. I'm sorry, but I'm not sure that you won't actually be absorbed by the USA, considering the governments you keep electing. But I'd dearly love to be really, really wrong on that one. However, I have to point out that as the USA starts to run out of resources, it will then start casting greedy eyes on your rich fields. And if there's one thing I can say about the progressiveness of Canada, it's that you were well ahead of the game, actually, in putting a glove puppet into supreme power. But that was a digression. Let's get back to the Soviet Union. The old Soviet Union, the one that disintegrated when they tried a coup against Gorbachev. Do you remember that? Naturally, since they had no other model than a military coup, that's the model they chose. But as they say, generals are always fighting the last war. And it turned out that the age was long past for military coups. Technically advanced societies, even in Gorbachev's time, there was enough technical advancement for him to get the word out, and the coup failed. Gorbachev came back, and it turned out that that was the last convulsion of a dying political system. Now, the Democratic Party in America have been a lot cannier than the old-fashioned Soviets, who had nothing but a centralized state system to use as their model. The Democrats used the power of different branches of capitalism to achieve their ends. And if anything proves the superiority of capitalism, this particular last 6 months has demonstrated that in spades. Let's go back to the old-style Soviet Union again, to the time after Brezhnev, when the Politburo started installing nominal leaders, like Biden. Nominal leaders who were obviously incompetent. We all know that the Soviet Union, we all knew that the Soviet Union was on its way downhill when we saw the elderly Brezhnev standing on that balcony for the May Day parade, and it was obvious he didn't know what was going on. Some wags joked that he was actually dead. Then after him, what was there? There was Andropov, and he was in hospital for most of the time, and then there was Chernenko, and then he was ill most of the time, and after that it was Kuznetsov and Gromyko, all old revolutionaries from a previous age and all well worn out. After that was a transition when the newly formed but still basically communist Russian Federation propped up that worn out relic, the drunkard, Boris Yeltsin. The only thing I remember about Yeltsin was that time when his plane landed in Dublin airport and he was too drunk to get out of the plane and meet the Taoiseach. That's the Prime Minister of the government of the Republic of Ireland, who was left standing on the tarmac waiting for him, and he never turned up. So that was the Russia take on the period of stasis. Nothing happened. Everything got more ragged and more threadbare. There were a lot more, because it was now allowed, there were a lot of people left Russia at that time. And finally, including, by the way, Gorbachev, and finally a dictator took over because there was no choice. That was the Russian pattern. So what about the USA? Well, there's a different pattern. There was always a lot of decentralized power in the American model, and it's starting to re-establish itself, but it's not the decentralization of the state senates or the mayors or the governors. It's the decentralization of big tech companies instead. And after Biden, another geriatric might be shoveled into his vacancy, or Harris might continue for a while, but it really won't matter, because whoever sits in the Oval Office will be the servant of the big tech companies, which may not technically own the Democratic Party, but they will be terrified to contradict any of them in any way. And the big tech companies will have, as is usual, an instinct to hang on to power, and this will choke expression in America and potentially around the world. And that's why the other countries I mentioned will spring into importance. By the way, even Russia, which ironically seems to be establishing itself as a centre for, well, a refuge for free speech, at least in regard to opinions that are expressed in other countries outside Russia. And this stasis edging into decline will continue until something happens to upset it. Now, this is where I do offer you a tiny morsel of hope, and myself too, I might say. This whole business could go on for years and years and years. But the pace of development is much quicker now. So I do have hopes that the hegemony of the big tech companies might fragment much sooner than my pessimistic imagination is predicting. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Grambo with a firearm, or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com, and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.